The mop handle slipped in David's hand, and the bucket toppled, and a sheet of water flashed across the marble like a sudden wave, and the whole office froze in that bright morning hush. And then the laughter came sharp and hard, like glass under shoes, and the manager, with a tight jaw and silver tie, stepped forward and pointed at the spill like it was a crime scene, and he said, "People like you don't belong here," and the room buzzed with nervous smiles, while the janitor kept his eyes low as if the floor could swallow him, and the intern near the printers flinched and looked at him with a soft worry that did not fit this cold building. David knelt and scooped the yellow sign into place, and the manager barked, "Hurry up," and the sales team snickered, and someone filmed with a phone half hidden behind a folder, and the camera I felt like a sting on the back of his neck, and still he moved slow and steady, as if nothing could push him into anger, and the sun splashed on the glass walls and turned every desk into a stage, and every face into a mask, and the air smelled like coffee and toner and new money, and the manager kept talking about standards and image and excellence, and the word excellence hit like a cruel joke, because there was nothing excellent about humiliating a man for spilled water. The intern by the printers, her badge said Mia, whispered, "Do you need help?" And David shook his head gently and smiled in the kind way that old friends do when they are telling you it will be okay, and he wrung the mop and pulled the water into the throat of the drain, and the floor began to shine again, and the laughter thinned, and the phones rang, and the world pretended to move on, but it did not, because shame clings like smoke in a curtain. And the manager, Mr. Cole, turned at the threshold of his glass office and said, "Try not to embarrass us again," and the door closed with a hush that sounded like a snubbed candle. David hung the mop on its hook and walked toward the back corridor where the vending machine hummed like a tired bee, and he put his hand on the plastic window and looked at the reflection that stared back: an old shirt, clean but worn, tired shoes, polished but cracked, a face calm but carrying something deep like a river under snow. And he breathed in and out, and the breath steadied his chest, and he whispered so small that only his heart could hear if only they knew, and the words tasted strange because they were not a wish and not a threat. They were a truth that waited its turn like a sunrise behind a hit. At lunch, the cafeteria lights fell brighter, and the guard at the entrance checked badges with the bored rhythm of routine, and when David reached the gate, the guard raised a palm and said, "Staff eats downstairs," and someone in line giggled, and someone else whispered, "He spilled a whole ocean up there," and the joke bounced around like a ball and grew bigger and meaner, and Mia stepped out of line and said, "He can sit with me, I have guest privileges," and the guard shrugged and shook his head and tapped the policy sheet, and the paper crackled like a little thunder, and David said, "It's fine," and he turned away gentle and slow, because dignity walks even when the world shoves downstairs. The break room was quiet, and the microwave ticked, and the clock ticked, and he ate a simple sandwich and watched the hands crawl, and he listened to the building breathing, vents whispering, elevators sighing, printers chirping high and crisp like tiny birds, and every sound told him a story about the people upstairs and their hunger and their fear and their pride and their loneliness. And he folded the napkin the way he always did, neat and square like a small promise to himself that details matter. And then his phone buzzed, and the screen lit with a number that almost no one knew, and he pressed accept, and the voice said, "Tomorrow is the day," and he said, "I understand," and hung up, and the quiet came back like a blanket. Afternoon brought a new insult, wrapped like a test. The assistant from operations hurried down the hall and shoved a package into his arms and said, "Deliver to boardroom A, and hurry, the new investor is touring," and the box was heavier than it looked, and the edge cut into his palm, and he walked the long hall past photos of smiling teams and charity days and awards, and he thought about how pictures capture a second and call it truth, while people live whole storms that never make it to the frame. And at the boardroom door, he paused and looked through the glass and saw Mr. Cole rehearsing a smile in the reflection, practicing power like a coat, and he felt a warmth in his chest that was not anger and not triumph, just a kind of mercy for a man who did not know himself. He set the package on the table and left without a word, and behind him Mr. Cole said, "Make sure he signs an NDA if he ever comes in here again," and the assistant laughed, and the sound scratched like chalk, and David walked back to his cart and wiped the handle and aligned the spray bottles the way a careful hand lines up chess pieces before the first move. And Mia found him near the service elevator and said, "I'm sorry for how they treated you," and he said, "It's not your fault," and she nodded and said, "You're different, you look at this place like it belongs to you," and the words hung bright between them, and he answered softly, "Perhaps "It does, in a way," and she blinked as if the room shifted. Half an inch evening settled with the glow of monitor light, and the weary shuffle of heels, and the clack of last emails, and Mr. Cole strode past with the stride of a man who thinks the building moves for him, and he bumped David's shoulder without looking and said, "Watch it," and kept going, and the door clicked and the hallway was empty, and David cleaned the spill that was not there, as if erasing the day, and he rolled the cart into the closet, and clicked off the light, and the darkness wrapped him gentle, and he pressed his palm to the wood, and whispered tomorrow, and the word did not feel like a wish this time. It felt like a key turning, and a room opening, and a window lifting, and a dawn slipping in. Night draped itself across the city, and the office slept, and the cameras blinked their red eyes, and the cleaning crews finished their rounds, and the elevators hummed a lullaby, and under the quiet the building held its breath, and somewhere in that hush, David stood alone by the window on the 23rd floor and watched the streetlights throw gold coins on the road, and he saw his reflection standing over the city like a question, and he said to it, "You waited long enough," and the reflection nodded back, and the moment felt like the last step before solid ground. Morning cracked open with rain brushing the glass soft as a warning, and the lobby smelled like wet umbrellas and ambition, and the front desk buzzed with chatter about a tour and a new majority stakeholder, and a visit from people who make decisions with numbers that break hearts and fix them again. And David walked in through the service entrance with a thermos of tea and a face so calm it made the security guard lower his eyes, without knowing why, and he took the stairs, not the elevator, and felt each step like a count toward something that had already happened in another room, on another paper, in another time. In floor 17, the copy room word, and Mia fought with a jam, and the machine flashed red like a small panic, and David stepped beside her and touched 2 clips and a lever, and the crumpled paper slid free like a thorn from skin, and she laughed with relief and said, "How do you know every machine in this building?" And he said, "Because every machine tells you what it needs if you listen." And she looked at him as if he had just said something about life and not about printers, and then she lowered her voice and said, "Everyone is talking about the new owner, and Mr. Cole says he will charm him and keep his position." And David nodded and said, "Sometimes the wind changes without asking for permission." By 10, the atmosphere sharpened like a blade, and small cruelties started to cut again. The barista upstairs handed David a black coffee he had not ordered and said, "Here you go, buddy, since you can't go to the nice cafeteria." And a couple of analysts grinned and waited for a reaction, and he took the cup with a thank you that felt too big for the moment, and he left them standing in their own echo and their smiles dimmed without a target, and he set the coffee on his cart untouched, because victory is not sweet when it is built from bitterness, and he preferred tea and respects. Mr. Cole stormed out of his office with a file thick as a phone book and a cologne that arrived before he did, and he saw David near the corridor and said, "Keep clear of the executive wing today. We don't need background clutter." And the word clutter caught in the air like a fly in amber, and several heads turned and watched for a reaction, and David simply moved the cart aside, and in that quiet gesture there was a gravity that made Mr. Cole glance back without knowing why, like a man walking near a cliff and feeling a pull he cannot name. Near noon, the setup for the boardroom began. Water bottles aligned like soldiers' chairs, edged to a perfect angle, screens warmed to a welcoming blue, and the assistant placed a leather folder at the head seat embossed with initials, "Not from this building." And David walked through to change the rubbish, and he saw the folder and his eyes rested on it, the way you rest on a date that means everything. And he lifted the bin, and the liners crackled like dry leaves, and Mr. Cole said, "Careful with that centerpiece," and then softer, "To the team today decides our next 10 years, and his voice trembled at the corners, though he would deny it. And the hallway to employees argued about headcount cuts in low voices, and then went quiet when David passed, and he wondered how easily fear teaches people to be small, and how quickly respect could teach them to be big. And he thought of the night calls, the patient accumulation, the meetings where older men called him naive, and then later called him sir. And he thought of the neighborhoods where he learned the price of pride and the cost of silence, and he thought of his mother, who cleaned houses with a humming tune and told him that dignity is a coat you wear from the inside out. At 1 in the afternoon, Mia found him again near the freight elevator, and her hands were shaking a little because she had just seen the guest list flash on a tablet, and it included a name that did not belong among these polished letters and numbers. And she said, "David, I should not say this, but I saw a name that begins with D." and ends with Harris, and her eyes searched his face like a question she was afraid to ask, and he answered with a smile that carried both kindness and a hush, and he said some names are shared by many. And she nodded, but the tremor in her fingers eased, as if a secret had been placed on a soft shelf. Assistant from operations rushed over holding a sleek glass award that commemorated a sales milestone, and he thrust it into David's hands and said, "Take this to storage, and be careful, it costs more than your yearly salary." And Mia gasped at the cruelty, and David accepted the weight, and turned the award in his hands, and read the engraving about teamwork and integrity and excellence, and the words rang hollow like coins dropped on marble, and he walked the long hall to the service stairs, and halfway there he stopped and looked out at the city, and the rain had cleared, and the sky peeled open to a deeper blue, and the light fell across the glass in a way that made every reflection look like a double life down. In storage, among the quiet hum of sleeping equipment, he set the award gently on a shelf, and opened a small locker tucked behind a stack of folded tarps, and inside lay a single envelope and a key fob and a phone that had rung only twice in the last year, and he touched them the way a man touches a passport before a border, and then he closed the locker and let the darkness hide it all again, because timing is a language, and today it had to be spoken perfectly. When he came back up, the boardroom was filling with suits and smiles, and Mr. Cole greeted each person with that measured warmth that says, "Welcome to my kingdom," and he scanned the hall for any sign of disorder, and found David rolling past with his cart, and he snapped, "Bring that thing around the back, and keep out of sight," and the words cracked like a whip in a place where whips should be impossible, and a handful of people pretended not to see, and Mia clenched her jaw, and David's face did not change, but something in the air shifted the way air shifts before thunder, when you do not yet hear it, but your skin knows the clock's hands tapped toward 2, and then toward 2:05, and the room stood on tiptoe waiting, and the elevator dinged a silver note, and the doors slid open, and several strangers stepped out with eyes that measured and shoes that whispered. And behind them walked a woman with a tablet and a pen tucked in her hair, and she said, "The principal will be here in 3 minutes, please be ready," and the sentence unfolded like a curtain, and Mr. Cole swept the table with his gaze and tugged his jacket straight, and the staff held their breath the way audiences do before the first line of a play. In the quiet just before footsteps approached, David stood at the end of the corridor near a window where the city spread like an open book, and he took the key fob from his pocket and pressed it once, and somewhere a door unlocked, and a system recognized a name and a status and a right, and he felt the building shift as if it had turned slightly toward him, and then he slipped the fob away and pushed his cart forward, and Mia caught his eye and saw not a janitor carrying cleaning spray, but a man carrying a moment, and she felt the hairs on her arms rise, and she did not know why. The boardroom door opened wider, and Mr. Cole lifted his chin and began his practiced welcome, and the woman with the tablet stepped aside, and the principal did not enter, and for a heartbeat the whole building seemed to lean, and then footsteps sounded behind them from the service corridor. The one nobody important uses, the one that smells like lemon cleaner and old paint, and into the light of the room walked David with his cart and his steady gaze, and Mr. Cole's mouth opened then closed, like a fish at glass, and laughter tried to come, but fear arrived first and sat down in its chair. David parked the cart gently by the wall and straightened, and what happened next was not loud and not flashy, but it changed the temperature of the air. He reached into the side pocket and took out the envelope and set it at the head of the table, and the woman with the tablet looked at it, and then at him, and then at the faces around her, and her eyes widened a fraction the way eyes do when truth steps into the room without knocking, and Mia stood in the doorway with a hand over her mouth, and the assistant who had mocked salaries took a step back as if the floor tilted. Mr. Cole found his voice and tried to laugh and said, "What is the meaning of this, and who let you into this room?" And the woman with the tablet said quietly, "Sir, he didn't need letting in." And Mr. Cole blinked as if a light changed color in front of him, and he said, "I will handle this," and reached for the envelope, and David rested his fingers on it and said, "Not yet," and the words were soft, but they held the room like a gentle hand on a falling glass, and in that softness lived something unarguable like gravity. The city outside blazed with afternoon light, and the clock whispered its small metal truth, and in the stillness you could hear papers sigh and jackets rustle, and someone swallow hard, and Mr. Cole licked his lips and squared his shoulders and said then, "By all means present your cleaning schedule to the board," and the joke fell to the carpet without a sound, and David lifted the envelope and slid the contents across the table, and the woman with the tablet read the first page, and then the second, and then she raised her face and looked at David, with recognition that was also respect, and the world tilted into its next shape, and in that held breath before anyone spoke again, the building seemed to listen, as if it too were waiting to learn who truly belonged within its walls, and who had only been borrowing the echo of power. The documents slid across the polished wood like a secret, finally brave enough to show its face, and the board members leaned closer, and the woman with the tablet whispered, "The signatures are valid, and the dates check, and the percentages confirm. Controlling interest now belongs to Mr. David Harris," and the syllables struck the air like a bell that no one expected to hear in this temple of glass and steel, and Mr. Cole's face drained of its polished color, leaving him pale as paper. But pride is a stubborn mask, and he forced a laugh, sharp and hollow, and said, "This must be some prank. This is ridiculous." And yet no one laughed with him, because the silence in the room had changed shape, and the air itself bent differently around David, who stood calm with his hands folded like a man who has carried this weight for years, and now simply set it down. The assistant who once mocked him sputtered that this man is just a janitor, he cleans our trash, and the words echoed too loud, too brittle, like breaking porcelain. And David looked at him, not with anger but with a quiet that made the assistant step back, because some silences remind you how small cruelty really is. And Mia, near the door, saw it all, and her heart thudded with a mix of fear and awe, because she understood now why he had always walked the halls like they were already his. Mr. Cole grasped for control, turning to the board, declaring that this is absurd. "We cannot let a custodian run a corporation." But the chairman cleared his throat and said, "The shares speak louder than titles," and eyes turned from Cole to David, like compasses swinging north, and Cole's voice cracked as he snapped, "Security, remove him now." But the guards at the door hesitated, glancing at the documents, then at the calm authority in David's stance, and in that hesitation Cole felt power slip like sand through desperate fingers. David finally spoke, his voice even steady, carrying not anger but truth, and he said, "I have worked in this building not to mop floors, but to see hearts. I have seen who shows kindness when no one is watching, and who throws cruelty as if it were free, and today is not about revenge. It is about truth." And his words rolled out with the slow inevitability of tide, and every person in the room felt the pull. Cole sputtered and raged louder, accusing conspiracies, demanding dismissal, but the more he shouted the smaller he seemed, and whispers spread along the table, like dry leaves catching fire, the whispers saying, "It's real, he owns it, he has control now." And Cole's voice shook, trying to cover fear with arrogance, and David watched quietly, letting the man bury himself in his own noise. When the meeting finally broke, the word had already traveled faster than phones, through the hallways, through the cubicles, through the cafeteria, and the building buzzed with disbelief. "The janitor is the owner. The man with the mop is the new master." And laughter turned to gossip, and gossip turned to uneasy silence, and every face carried the same question, "What happens now?" Mia found him in the quiet elevator lobby and whispered, "You're really him, you're the owner." And David nodded once and said, "Sometimes truth wears humble clothes until it is time to be seen." And she asked, "Why endure their cruelty all this time?" And he said, "Because power reveals masks, but kindness reveals souls." And I needed to know who was who, and her eyes filled because she realized that every insult, every slight had been a mirror, not of him, but of man. Still conflict brewed, because Cole would not surrender pride so easily in his office. He gathered allies, whispering promises of positions and pay rises if they helped him resist, and he plotted to undermine David with policy and procedure. But the cracks were showing, and his allies wavered because they had seen the documents too, and they knew the wind had changed. That night, David stood again by the high window, watching the city breathe with lights, and he felt the storm building, not outside but inside these walls, and he whispered, "Tomorrow we face the truth." And tomorrow came with footsteps louder than thunder. The board reconvened under pressure, and Cole arrived polished as ever, but with desperation hanging around him like smoke, and he carried a speech about legacy and image and stability, and he leaned on old allies with trembling hands disguised as firm grips, and he spoke loudly to drown his own doubt. But when David entered the room, the noise softened like curtains falling, and he carried no folder, no entourage, only the quiet certainty that truth is enough. And he took the head seat, not with arrogance, but with the calm weight of someone who has earned it with years of patience and sacrifice, and every eye followed him, as if the air itself required it. Cole rose and declared that this man is unfit. He is uneducated, unrefined, unseen by the circles of power, and he cannot represent us. And David looked at him steadily and said, "You judge by suits and shoes, I judge by hearts and deeds, and today we let the deeds speak." And he gestured to the woman with the tablet, who read aloud the proof of ownership, the timeline of purchases, the legality of transfers, and each word was a stone building a wall around David's claim and dismantling the fragile tower of Cole's denial. The revelation spread beyond the boardroom like wildfire. Employees pressed ears to doors, messages pinged across departments' phones, buzzed with shock. The janitor is the owner, the truth is written in ink, and Cole's empire of mockery cracked like ice under sudden heat. David then revealed why he chose this path, his voice carrying through the hush. "I walked these halls as one of the invisible because I needed to see who among you respects without needing status, and who among you tramples others. When you think no one is watching, I have seen enough, and today the masks fall and the truth stands." Gasps rose because people remembered every cruel word, every shove, every laugh, and they realized those moments were now heavy with consequence. And Cole paled, knowing his arrogance was carved into too many memories and could not be erased. And then came the turning point. Cole lunged, verbally accusing David of manipulation, claiming fraud, demanding delay, but the board chair raised a hand and said, "Enough. We cannot deny what is written," and signed, "The company belongs to him." And in that instant, the room shifted forever. David no longer the janitor, David now the leader, and Cole no longer the master, but a man revealed, small, bitter, desperate. Mia, in the corner, felt her chest swell with pride because she had seen his kindness when no one else would, and now she witnessed the world see him as he truly was, and tears touched her eyes, not of sadness but of awe. The revelation was not just about money or shares, it was about how truth hides in plain sight, waiting for its moment to rise like dawn, and when it rises, no curtain, no arrogance, no cruelty can hold it back. The boardroom air grew heavy like thunder waiting to break, and Mr. Cole stood trembling in a suit that no longer looked like power, but like a costume, and he shouted that this company will fall under a janitor, and his voice cracked with the edge of fear. And the staff outside the glass walls pressed closer to see what would happen next, and whispers traveled like electricity through every corridor. The moment of reckoning had arrived. It rose from his chair slowly with no rush, because real authority does not hurry, and he faced Cole with calm eyes that made silence louder than any scream, and he said, "You think leadership is measured by cruelty, but it is measured by respect. You think power is measured by money, but it is measured by truth, and today truth has chosen, and it did not choose you." And the words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through every heart in the room. Cole's face twisted with disbelief and anger, and he tried one last desperate strike, saying, "If you fire me, this company will collapse, because I am the only one who knows how to keep it alive." And David looked at him with a softness that was sharper than steel, and said that it was already dead, because no company should depend on arrogance to breathe. And he turned to the board and declared, "Mr. Cole, your service ends today, effective immediately." Gasps filled the air. Some covered their mouths, some whispered justice, some could not believe what they had just witnessed. And Cole stumbled back, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the marble, and for the first time his eyes looked small in a room where he once filled every corner, and he realized that all his pride, all his cruelty had left him utterly alone. No one stood up to defend him, no one offered a hand, because arrogance never builds bridges, it only burns them. David turned then to the employees gathered outside the glass walls, and he opened the doors so everyone could hear, and he said, "Many of you have been kind, many of you have been cruel. Today we start new, and I will remember who stood where, when respect was free to give." And the staff shifted uneasily because they knew every small act had been witnessed and would now carry weight. Then he called Mia forward, the intern whose small kindness had been a light in long dark days, and he said, "You saw me when I was invisible, and that vision is rare and precious. So today you are promoted. You will not fetch coffee, you will build futures." And her eyes brimmed with tears as applause rose around her, and she whispered, "Thank you, sir." And he answered, "Call me David, because titles mean less than truth." The climax reached its peak when Cole shouted one last curse and stormed from the room, pushing through the crowd. But the people did not step aside with fear, they stepped aside with relief, as if a storm had finally passed. and the sun could return, and the sight of his retreat etched itself into memory as the day power shifted forever. And, in that moment, David stood, not as a janitor, not as an owner, not even as a man who had been mocked and risen, but as a mirror for everyone to see themselves, and the reflection was unflinching. It showed kindness rewarded, cruelty exposed, and justice restored. The building felt different. The very walls seemed to breathe easier, as if respect had opened a window and let fresh air in, and employees walked lighter, though still unsure, because change is both freedom and fear. And David gathered them all in the atrium, where the glass ceiling let the afternoon light pour like grace upon the crowd. He stood on no podium and held no microphone, but his voice carried clear and steady, and he said, "I lived among you not to spy, but to learn. I wanted to see who you were when you thought no one important was watching. I wanted to know if kindness survived in a place where ambition often crushes it, and I learned much more than I expected. I learned that cruelty hides behind laughter, and pride hides behind suits, but I also learned that compassion whispers even when the room is loud, and that whisper is stronger than any shout." He looked at Mia and said, "Kindness costs nothing, but it is the only wealth that grows when shared." And he looked at the rest and said, "I will not lead as a tyrant, I will lead as a servant, because true leadership is service. And those who mocked me mocked only themselves. Those who respected me respected themselves. And today, we start again on that truth." The crowd stood hushed, and some wept quietly because his words did not sound like policy. They sounded like life, and hearts that had been hard with routine softened, and hands that had been quick to point began to lower. In humility, then he told them a final lesson, one he had carried for years. Respect is not earned by titles, it is given by choice, and every choice you make shapes the world around you. Treat the lowest among you with dignity, because tomorrow the lowest may stand above you. And the room absorbed the weight of those words like soil drinking rain. The staff dispersed slowly, each carrying the echo of his truth, and in corners, whispers grew, not of gossip, but of reflection, people recalling their own moments of kindness or cruelty, measuring themselves against the mirror David had held up, and realizing they could choose better. Mia walked beside him at the end of the day and said, "You changed everything today." And he smiled and said, "No, we all did, because truth is never carried by one, it is carried by every choice, every action, every heart." And she nodded, feeling the future open like a door. And when the lights dimmed and the building rested, David stood once more at the tall window, watching the city glow alive below, and he whispered to the reflection, "Respect costs nothing, but without it, everything costs too much." And the reflection nodded back with quiet agreement, and the night wrapped him not in loneliness but in peace, because at last dignity had its rightful place, and justice had spoken in a voice everyone could hear. The end.